The evening air in Penbrook plantation hung heavy with the scent of magnolias and damp earth, that relentless summer warmth clinging to the skin like a second layer. Elias Penbrook stepped onto the wide veranda, his boots echoing softly against the weathered oak planks. At 42, he carried the weight of the estate on his broad shoulders, his calloused hands bearing witness to years of tending fields that yielded less each season since the war's end. He paused at the railing, gazing out over the sprawling grounds where Spanish moss draped from ancient live oaks like funeral veils. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples, and Elias felt the familiar ache in his chest, not just from the day's labor, but from the quiet that had settled over the house since his wife, Clara, passed 2 winters back. Inside, the parlor glowed faintly from the oil lamps, but Elias preferred the candles tonight. He lit 3 on the mantel, their flames flickering to life with a soft hiss, casting long shadows that danced across the faded wallpaper. His daughter, Lydia, 16 and sharp-eyed as her mother, knelt by the hearth, arranging kindling for the fire. Her dark hair was pinned back simply, but a few strands escaped, framing her face in the warm light. She had Clara's wit, quick and cutting, though lately it masked a wariness Elias couldn't quite pierce. "Father," she said without looking up, her voice steady. The hands mentioned seeing lights in the old barn again, flickering like will-o'-the-wisps. Elias grunted, settling into his armchair with a creak of leather. "Superstition. They've got idle tongues since the cotton's thin." But his eyes lingered on the candles, watching how the flames bent slightly, as if nudged by an unseen breath. The plantation had always whispered its secrets, stories of restless spirits from the days of the Revolution, or worse, from the chains that once bound the fields. He dismissed them as tales to scare children, yet tonight, the house felt watchful. From the staircase came the soft patter of feet. Young Thomas, Lydia's brother at 12, bounded into the room, his freckled face alight with mischief. He was the bold one, all gangly limbs and unbridled curiosity, forever poking into corners he shouldn't. "Pa, I found this in the attic." He held up a tarnished silver candelabra, its arms twisted like gnarled branches, 3 sockets empty and waiting. It was under a sheet, covered in dust. "Looks old, like pirate treasure." Lydia glanced over, her lips quirking. "Or like something grandfather would have hidden from the Yankees." She rose, brushing soot from her skirt, and took the candelabra from Thomas. Her fingers traced the engravings, faint spirals that seemed to shift in the candlelight. Elias watched, a flicker of unease stirring. The attic was off limits, a maze of trunks and forgotten finery from better days. "Where exactly, son?" he asked, his tone even. Thomas shrugged, plopping onto the rug. "Behind the big mirror. There was a draft up there, cold even in this heat. And I swear, Pa, the floorboards creaked like someone was walking right behind me." He mimicked the sound, a low groan that echoed oddly in the room. Lydia lit the candles in the new holder, placing it on the side table. As the wicks caught, the flames steadied, unnaturally bright, illuminating motes of dust that swirled without wind. Elias leaned forward, rubbing his jaw. The war had taken much, friends, fortune, even his faith in simple things like a quiet night. But family anchored him. Lydia's quiet strength, Thomas's fire. "Put it away tomorrow," he said finally. "We don't need ghosts rattling our chains." Yet as he spoke, the candle on the mantel guttered, and for a heartbeat, the shadows in the corner of the room thickened, outlining a shape too tall, too still. Lydia's hand paused midair, her breath catching. Thomas froze, eyes wide, and in that shared silence, the house seemed to lean in, listening. Outside, the cicadas' chorus swelled, but inside, the air grew taut, as if the plantation itself held its breath. Elias stood, moving to the window, peering into the gathering dusk. The old barn loomed at the edge of the fields, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. No lights now, just the endless dark. He turned back, forcing a smile for the children.
"Bedtime."
Dawn comes early. But as Lydia extinguished the parlor candles one by one, The last flame lingered longest, casting a final, fleeting image on the wall. Not shadows, but the faint trace of fingers, pressing from the other side. Elias Penbrook wiped the sweat from his brow, the attic air thick with the scent of aged wood and dust motes dancing in the faint light from the single grimy window. The candle in his hand flickered, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers across the rafters. He'd come up here after supper, drawn by the uneasy murmurs from downstairs, his wife Clara's voice sharp with worry, their daughter Lila's questions hanging unanswered. The family estate, Penbrook Hall, had always felt too vast for their shrinking numbers since the war ended, but tonight it pressed in closer, as if the walls themselves were listening. He stepped carefully over a pile of forgotten trunks, their leather cracked and brass fittings dulled by years of neglect. The flame dipped low, nearly guttering out in a draught he couldn't place, and Elias cupped his hand around it, murmuring a curse under his breath. South Carolina summers lingered even into September, but up here the chill seeped through the floorboards like an uninvited breath. He'd heard the old tales from his grandfather, whispers of spirits tied to the land, restless souls from the plantation days who wouldn't cross over without their due. Foolish notions, he'd always thought, but the war had stripped away such certainties, leaving only the weight of survival. A soft creak echoed from the far corner, and Elias froze. Not the house settling. No, this was deliberate, like a footfall testing the boards. He raised the candle higher, its glow pushing back the darkness, just enough to reveal a shape huddled against the wall. At first, he thought it a trick of the light, a bundle of rags or an animal seeking shelter. But as the flame steadied, the figure sharpened. A woman, pale and translucent, her dress a faded calico that might have been worn a generation ago. She didn't move, didn't breathe, but her eyes, dark hollows, fixed on him with a hunger that made his pulse thunder. Elias. Clara's voice called from the stairs below, muffled but urgent. He didn't answer, couldn't tear his gaze away. The woman's form shimmered, edges blurring as if dissolving into the air, yet she remained, one hand extended slightly, palm upturned as though begging alms. The candle's wax dripped hot onto his fingers, snapping him back. He blinked hard, and she was gone. Or had she been there at all? The corner stood empty now, save for a faint outline in the dust, like a body imprint left too long. Shaking his head, Elias descended the narrow stairs, the candle clutched tightly. The hallway below was dimly lit by oil lamps, their steady burn a comfort after the attic's caprice. Clara waited at the bottom, her arms crossed over her apron, lines of fatigue etching her face deeper than the summer sun ever could. Lila, just turned 12, hovered behind her, clutching a rag doll with eyes sewn from buttons that seemed to stare accusingly. "What were you doing up there?" Clara asked, her tone laced with that cautious edge she'd honed since the Yankees marched through. She was the steady one, the planner who tallied every bushel of corn and every bolt of cloth, while Elias chased ghosts in the heat. Checking for leaks, he lied smoothly, though his voice caught. No need to stir more fear. The war had taken enough from them already, his brother at Gettysburg, half the field scorched. Nothing but cobwebs. Lila tilted her head, her braids swinging. "I heard something scratching earlier, Pa, like nails on wood." Her words were matter of fact, but her grip on the doll tightened, knuckles whitening. Clara shot him a look, the kind that said she knew better but wouldn't press. "Supper's cold. Come eat before it spoils." She turned toward the kitchen, but Elias lingered, glancing back up the stairs. The house was silent now, oppressively so, as if holding its breath. That night, as the family gathered around the scarred oak table, Elias lit the candles, not the attic's lone stub, but the cluster of beeswax ones his mother had saved from before the blockade. They burned clean and bright, illuminating the simple meal of cornbread and greens. Clara portioned out the portions with practiced efficiency, her movements brave in their routine, while Lila chattered about the mockingbirds in the orchard, her wit peeking through in imitations that drew a reluctant smile from her father. But as the flames danced, Elias noticed it first, shadows that didn't match the light. At the edge of the table, Beyond the circle of glow, forms flickered into view. Guests unbidden, seated as if at a feast. A man in a tattered Confederate coat, his face gaunt with starvation. A child no older than Lila, translucent fingers reaching for a plate that wasn't there. They didn't speak, didn't move beyond the subtle sway of their outlines, but their presence chilled the air, frosting the window panes despite the humid night. Clara's fork paused midway to her mouth. "Elias, do you see them?" He nodded, throat dry. Lila whimpered, scooting her chair closer to her mother. The hidden guests watched, patient as the grave, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like distant stars. Whatever bargain the house demanded, it had begun to show its hand. Elias Penbrook wiped the sweat from his brow, the attic air thick as molasses under the July sun. The trapdoor creaked open wider, revealing dust-choked beams and forgotten trunks that hulked like forgotten beasts. His sister Clara clutched the candle, its flame flickering against the shadows that seemed to lean in, hungry. "We shouldn't be up here," she whispered, her voice a threadbare plea, but Elias pressed on, his boots thudding softly on the warped planks. The journal lay wedged between two crates, its leather cover cracked like parched earth. Elias pried it free, coughing as motes danced in the light. Inside, faded ink chronicled their great-uncle's nights. The guests come when the candles burn low. They whisper from the walls, seeking warmth we cannot give. Clara peered over his shoulder, her caution warring with curiosity. "Papa said the old man was touched by fever. This is just his ravings." But as Elias turned the pages, a chill unrelated to the draft snaked down his spine. ES dotted the margins, elongated figures with eyes like polished stones, lurking at the edges of candlelit rooms. One drawing mirrored the parlor below, the family table, chairs askew, and in the corner, a shape that didn't belong. "Look," Elias said, his bravery cracking just a fraction. He held the candle closer, and for a heartbeat, the flame dipped as if bowed by an unseen breath. Downstairs, their mother called faintly, her voice muffled by the floorboards. Clara tugged at Elias's sleeve. "We need to show this to her." "But what if it's real? What if they're already here?" Elias snapped the journal shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the confined space. He nodded, resolve hardening his jaw, but as they descended, the attic door swung shut behind them with a whisper of wood on wood, latching without a touch. In the hallway, the house settled with a groan, as if sighing in relief. Elias gripped the journal tighter, the weight of hidden eyes pressing on his back. The candles in the sconces burned steady now, but their light felt borrowed, casting long shadows that trailed them like silent followers. Elias Penbrook gripped the candlestick tighter, its wax dripping like slow tears onto the scarred oak table. The flame flickered in the draft from the attic stairs, casting shadows that twisted across the walls of the old storage room. He'd come up here alone after supper, telling Clara he needed to fetch the extra linens, but really, it was to escape the whispers that had started among the family. Eliza's sharp eyes had caught him slipping away, but she'd said nothing, just watched with that knowing tilt to her head. The air up here hung heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something sharper, mothballs, or perhaps the faint rot of forgotten things. Elias moved deeper into the gloom, his boots creaking on the uneven floorboards. He held the candle high, its light probing the corners where crates loomed like silent sentinels. That's when he saw it. Not the linens, but the flicker. Just beyond the steady glow, a shape shifted. Not a rat, not the sway of a hanging quilt. It was a silhouette, tall and indistinct, as if the darkness itself had thickened into form. He froze, breath catching. The flame danced, and for a heartbeat, the shape resolved, a figure in tattered broadcloth, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, standing utterly still amid the stacks of trunks. Elias blinked, heart pounding against his ribs. When he raised the candle higher, the figure vanished, leaving only empty air and the glint of brass latches. A trick of the light, he told himself, the kind that plagued old houses after stormy nights. But his hand trembled as he set the candlestick down, wax pooling in a small, accusing puddle. Downstairs, the parlor clock struck 10, its chimes muffled through the floor. Elias hurried back, linens forgotten under his arm as an excuse. Clara looked up from her mending by the hearth, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Find what you needed?" she asked, voice steady, but eyes searching his face. "Something," he muttered, glancing at the single candle on the mantel. Its flame burned clean, revealing nothing but the familiar weave of her shawl. Thomas lounged in the armchair, whittling a stick with deliberate strokes, while Eliza perched on the windowsill, staring out at the moonlit yard. The boy had been quiet all evening, his usual restless energy subdued since the incident with the lantern in the barn yesterday, when he'd sworn he'd seen eyes watching from the shadows. Elias sank into a chair, the linens tumbling to the floor. "Up in the attic," he began, keeping his voice low, "I thought I saw a man. Standing there, plain as day in the candlelight. Then gone like smoke." Clara's needle resumed its rhythm, but slower now. "The wind plays tricks. We've all been on edge since the fever passed." Thomas looked up, knife stilling. "It ain't the wind, Pa. I saw one too, out by the smokehouse. Looked right at me when I lit the lantern to check the hams." Eliza turned from the window, her wit sharpening into something edged. "And I heard footsteps last night, pacing the hall after we blew out the candles. Soft, like bare feet on the rugs." She crossed her arms, chin lifted defiantly. "We're not imagining it. Whatever it is, the light shows them. Only when it's steady flame, not the sun or lamps." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire dying to embers. Elias rubbed his temples, the weight of the plantation pressing down, the debts from the war, the empty fields, the isolation that bound them like vines. Hiring help was out of the question. Folks in town whispered of the Penbrook place being cursed since the old master's time. If these guests were real, they couldn't ignore it. But calling a preacher or the sheriff, that would brand them mad, or worse, draw prying eyes to secrets better buried. "We'll check the house tomorrow, daylight," Elias decided, forcing resolve into his tone. "Board up the attic, seal the doors. No more candles after dusk, just the hearth." Clara nodded, though her eyes lingered on the mantel flame, where a shadow seemed to stretch a fraction too long. As they rose to retire, Thomas snuffed the candle with a quick pinch, plunging the parlor into firelit warmth. But in that instant of snuffing, Elias glimpsed it again, a fleeting outline at the edge of the glow, closer now, as if drawn by the dying light. Sleep came fitful that night, the house groaning under a rising wind. Elias lay awake, listening to the patter of rain on the roof, wondering if the shapes would wait for dawn or creep nearer in the dark. By morning, the plan felt fragile, a thin barrier against whatever hungered in the corners of their home. The flame in Elias's hand trembled as he held the candle aloft, its wax dripping like slow tears onto the scarred oak table. The dining room, once the heart of Penbrook Plantation, now felt like a tomb, shadows clinging to the corners where moonlight dared not reach. Clara pressed against the wall, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the wick. It had been her idea to relight them all at once, every candelabrum, every lantern in the house, to flush out whatever lurked. But now, as the glow spread, she regretted the boldness that had surged through her veins like fever. "See there," Margaret whispered, her voice a threadbare veil over fear. She pointed to the far end of the table, where the light caught an edge, sharp and unnatural. Not a trick of the eye, but a form, hunched, elongated, as if the shadows themselves had grown limbs. Elias stepped forward, his boots thudding dully on the rug, the candle's heat warming his knuckles. "Stay back," he muttered to his wife, though his own pulse hammered a retreat in his chest. The figure didn't move at first, just shimmered in the flickering orange, its outline blurring like ink in water. Clara's fingers dug into the wallpaper, peeling fragments under her nails. She'd seen glimpses before, fleeting shapes in the attic, whispers in the garden, but this was solid, insistent. The candle's light peeled back layers, revealing not emptiness, but presence, a man, or what had been one, his face gaunt, eyes hollow pits that drank the flame without reflecting it. He wore the tattered remnants of a Confederate coat, buttons dulled by decades of dust. Elias raised the candle higher, and the guest shifted, a low rasp escaping its throat like whined through cracked boards. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his voice steady despite the quiver in his arm. No answer came, only a tilt of the head, as if appraising him. Margaret clutched Clara's shoulder, her grip bruising. Elias put it down. "We shouldn't have," but Clara pulled free, stepping into the light's edge. "It's from the war," she said, the words tumbling out before caution could snare them. "The old stories. Soldiers who never left." The figure's hand twitched, extending toward the candle, fingers curling like roots seeking soil. The air thickened, carrying a scent of damp earth and gunpowder, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the walls breathing in rhythm with the flame. Elias swung the candle away, but not before the guest lunged, a blur of shadow and sinew, knocking the light from his grasp. It clattered to the floor, wax pooling like blood, the wick hissing out. Darkness rushed in, swallowing the table, the chairs, the family. In that instant, Clara heard it. Footsteps, multiple now, echoing from the hall, as if the candles had invited not one, but a host. Elias fumbled for the matches in his pocket, cursing under his breath, while Margaret's sob broke the silence. The first plan had backfired. The light hadn't banished them, it had called them home. Elias Penbrook wiped the sweat from his brow, the attic air thick with the scent of dust and old wax. The single candle he'd lit flickered on the warped floorboards, casting long shadows that danced like fingers reaching for the family's secrets. Below, in the main house, his wife Clara's voice rose in a hushed argument with their daughter, Lila. But up here, the world narrowed to the trunk before him, a relic from his grandfather's time, its leather cracked and brass latch stubborn under his trembling fingers. He'd come up here after the third night of whispers, when the candles in the dining room had burned low and revealed shapes in the corners, translucent figures huddled like beggars at a feast, their eyes hollow but fixed on the family. Not ghosts, not exactly. Elias had read enough in those forbidden books smuggled from Charleston to know they were echoes, remnants of the plantation's shadowed past, drawn out by the flame's honest light. The Penbrooks had lived in this crumbling estate for generations, but the war had stripped away the illusions, leaving only the truth. The land hungered for what it had lost. Prying open the trunk, Elias sifted through yellowed letters and tarnished silver. At the bottom lay the oil lantern, its glass etched with symbols his grandfather had sworn would bind the unseen. "Light reveals, but focus commands," the old man had muttered on his deathbed. Elias lit it now, the blue-tinted flame steadying into a beam that pierced the gloom. For a moment, the attic seemed empty, the shadows retreating. But then, from the far rafter, a soft scrape, like nails on wood. He froze. The lantern's light swept upward, and there it was. Not one guest, but two, perched like ravens in human form. Their faces were gaunt, clothes ragged from an era of shackles and whips, eyes gleaming with unspoken accusations. One, a woman with braids unraveling like frayed ropes, extended a hand, her voice a rasp that echoed without sound. Give us the flame, master. Let us warm. Elias's heart hammered. He backed toward the ladder, the lantern shaking in his grip. These weren't the vague shapes from downstairs. They were clearer, bolder, as if the attic's isolation had fed them strength. Downstairs, Clara was trying to convince Lila to leave, to pack what little they had and flee to her sisters in Columbia. But Elias knew running wouldn't help. The guests followed the bloodline, clinging like damp rot to the walls. The male figure shifted, his form flickering as if struggling against the light's restraint. "You lit the candle," he seemed to say, lips moving in silence. "Now honor the dead." Elias remembered the stories. His ancestors had used candles to summon labor from the unseen, binding souls to the fields with promises of freedom that never came. The flames had hidden the cruelty, but now, in the war's aftermath, the bindings frayed. A floorboard creaked below. Lila's footsteps, quick and light. "Papa?" Her voice carried up, laced with fear. Elias doused the lantern hastily, plunging the attic into darkness. The shapes dissolved, but their chill lingered on his skin. He descended the ladder, the house groaning around him like a beast stirring from sleep. In the kitchen, Clara paced, her apron twisted in her hands. Lila sat at the table, 13 and sharp-eyed, twisting a lock of her dark hair. The single candle between them burned low, its wax pooling like blood. "We can't stay," Clara said, her voice steady but edged with a caution that had kept them alive through Reconstruction's lean years. "Last night, I saw them in the mirror, watching while I brushed my hair. They're not leaving." Lila glanced at Elias as he entered, her wit turning to worry. "Papa, what if we just blow them all out? No light, no guests." Elias set the lantern on the counter, its weight a reminder of failure. He'd hoped it would banish them, but it had only sharpened their gaze. "Blowing out the light won't end this," he said, sinking into a chair. His bravery, the trait that had carried him through battles, felt hollow now. "They're tied to us, to what this house did." Clara stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. "Then we fight it. Burn sage, like the old women in town say. Or salt the thresholds." Her practicality cut through the dread, but Elias saw the tremor in her hands. She, the cautious one, was fraying too. Outside, the South Carolina night pressed against the windows, cicadas humming a dirge. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. They gathered what they could, bundles of dried herbs from the garden, coarse salt from the pantry, and began the ritual as the candle sputtered. Lila sprinkled salt along the doors, her movements quick, almost defiant. "If they're guests, maybe they just need inviting properly," she quipped, but her voice cracked. As midnight neared, the first ward went up. Elias lit a new candle in the hearth, murmuring the words from memory. Bindings reversed, debts paid in shadow. For a heartbeat, the house fell silent. Then, from the attic, a low moan rippled down, and the candle's flame twisted unnaturally, stretching toward the ceiling like a plea. Clara gripped his arm. "It's working," she whispered, but Elias knew better. The guests weren't fleeing. They were gathering, the light pulling them closer. In the flickering glow, faint outlines shimmered at the edges of the room. More than before, their forms multiplying like whispers in the dark. The ritual had awakened something deeper, and the night stretched on, heavy with the weight of revelations yet to come. Elias Penbrook gripped the mantelpiece, his knuckles whitening against the rough-hewn oak, as the candle's flame danced erratically in the draught seeping through the cabin's cracks. The wax had burned low, pooling in a misshapen puddle that mirrored the unease twisting in his gut. Outside, the South Carolina night pressed in like a living thing, the cicadas chorus a relentless drone that masked any subtler sounds, footsteps, perhaps, or the rustle of something not quite human. He glanced at his wife, Clara, who sat rigid in the rocker by the hearth, her sewing forgotten in her lap. Their daughter, young Mira, huddled closer to her, eyes wide but silent, as if she'd learned too early that words could summon what lurked. The hidden guests had revealed themselves not in the blaze of midday, but in the intimate flicker of that single candle 2 nights prior. Shapes in the shadows, elongated and wrong, peering from the corners where the light bent unnaturally. Elias had dismissed it at first, fatigue from the harvest, the whiskey he'd shared with old Harlan. But Clara had seen them too, her hand flying to her mouth as a figure detached from the wall, its form dissolving like smoke only to reform inches away. They weren't ghosts, not in the spectral sense. These were guests uninvited, drawn by the family's isolation on the Penbrook plot, their presence a slow poison that soured the air and quickened the pulse. Now, in the dim glow, Elias weighed the shotgun leaning against the wall. Loaded with buckshot, it felt heavier than salvation. "We can't stay bottled up like this," he muttered, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. Clara's gaze flicked to him, sharp and unyielding. Her caution had always balanced his bravery, a tether in storms both literal and otherwise. "And run where?" "The nearest town's a day's ride, And the roads are mud after that rain. Whatever they are, they've marked us. Leaving might just invite them along. Mira shifted, her small fingers clutching Clara's skirt. The girl had always been the quiet one, observant, with a wit that surfaced in unexpected barbs, but fear had stripped that away. Papa, the candle, it showed the tall one again last night. By the window. It didn't move, but I felt it watching. Her words hung, fragile as spider silk, and Elias felt a chill snake down his spine. The tall one. That's what they'd named the foremost shadow, the one that lingered longest when the light waned. Others flitted at its edges, lesser shades, but it commanded them, a silent sentinel. He pushed off the mantle, crossing to the window in 3 strides. The glass was fogged, but wiping it clear revealed only the moonlit yard, the gnarled oak standing sentinel over the vegetable patch. No shape stirred, yet the sense of eyes upon him prickled his neck. The challenge wasn't just survival, it was the erosion, the way these guests fed on their isolation, amplifying doubts until actions faltered. Yesterday's plan, to burn sage from the root cellar and recite the old protections Harlan had sworn by, had backfired spectacularly. The smoke had thickened the shadows instead, drawing the tall one closer, its form brushing Myra's arm in the haze. She'd screamed then, a sound that still echoed in Elias's dreams, and in the aftermath, a faint bruise bloomed on her skin, like ink seeping through paper. Clara rose, setting the sewing aside with deliberate calm. We adapt, then. No more waiting for dawn. Her voice carried that earnest resolve, the kind that had seen them through the war's end and the lean years after. She moved to the table, lighting a second candle from the first, its flame steadier, casting warmer light that pushed the corners back a fraction. Elias nodded, grabbing the shotgun. Together, they barricaded the door with the heavy oak bench, Mira helping as best she could, her small hands trembling but sure. The air grew thicker, the cicadas falling silent, as if in anticipation. As the candles burned brighter, the shadows recoiled, but not without resistance. A low whisper slithered from the rafters, formless words that tugged at Elias's resolve, promises of ease, of release from the farm's burdens. He shook it off, focusing on Clara's steady instructions. Salt the thresholds, every window and crack. They worked in tandem, the family's rhythm unbroken despite the dread coiling tighter. Mira scattered the grains with fierce determination, her wit resurfacing in a muttered, "Take that, you lurking devils." But the cost lingered. As the first hints of false dawn grayed the sky, Elias noticed the candles guttering faster, their wax depleting unnaturally. The tall one hadn't retreated fully. It waited, patient, in the eaves, a promise that adaptation was merely delay. The family drew closer, breaths sinking in the fragile light, knowing the hidden guests hungered not for flesh, but for the unraveling of their bond, one flicker at a time. Elias Penbrook gripped the mantle, his knuckles whitening against the polished oak, as the candle's flame danced erratically in the draught seeping through the parlor's warped floorboards. The wax had burned low, pooling like congealed blood on the silver holder, but it still held, that unnatural steadiness, when the hidden ones drew near. Outside, the cicadas' chorus had fallen silent, leaving only the distant rumble of thunder over the low-country marshes. He glanced at Lydia, his sister, who sat rigid in the wingback chair, her embroidery needle poised mid-stitch, eyes fixed on the flickering light. "It's them again," she whispered, her voice a threadbare veil over the fear that had etched lines into her face these past weeks. The candles had started it all, those heirloom tapers from their mother's trousseau, meant for weddings and wakes. But in this house, built on the ruins of an old indigo plantation, they revealed more than shadows. Last night, under the glow, Elias had seen the outlines first, a translucent figure at the foot of his bed, its form shifting like smoke from a snuffed wick. Not ghosts, not quite. Something older. Guests uninvited since the war's end, when the fields lay fallow and the family's fortunes curdled. Lydia set her needlework aside, the hoop tumbling to the rug with a soft thud. "We can't keep pretending it's the fever dreams from that yellow jack scare." The servants fled because they saw it too, the way the air thickens, like breathing through wet silk. She rose, her skirts rustling, and moved to the window, peering into the moonless night. The plantation's live oaks loomed like sentinels, their Spanish moss hanging limp, as if the tree itself anticipated the storm. Elias nodded, forcing his hand to release the mantle. He was the cautious one, always had been, tallying ledgers and mending fences while their father chased Confederate ghosts in Charleston taverns. But caution felt like surrender now. The journal, father's scribbles in the attic. He mentioned wards, sigils etched into the candle molds. If we relight them in the root cellar, maybe we can force the things to show themselves fully. His words hung heavy, laced with the doubt that had gnawed at him since the first sighting. The hidden guests didn't speak, didn't touch, but their presence drained the color from the walls, left dishes unwashed and mirrors fogged with breath that wasn't theirs. A floorboard creaked upstairs, deliberate, like a footfall testing the silence. Lydia spun, her hand flying to her throat. That's not the house settling. Go check, Elias. I'll bar the door. Her bravery was a front, he knew, brittle as the shell of an oyster, but it steadied him. He snatched the poker from the hearth, its iron cool and reassuring in his palm, and started for the stairs, each step echoing his pounding heart. The hallway stretched longer than it should, the wallpaper's faded florals blurring at the edges under the sconce light. Halfway up, the air grew colder, carrying a faint scent of brine and decay, as if the Atlantic had seeped into the bones of the house. Elias paused at the landing, listening. Another creak, closer now, from his father's old study. He pushed the door open with the poker, the hinges sighing like a held breath released. Inside, the room was a tomb of neglect, dust-shrouded bookshelves, a desk cluttered with yellowed maps of Carolina coasts. But the candle on the desk, unlit, yet its wick glowed faintly, as if fed by an inner fire. Elias approached, the poker trembling slightly. As he neared, the flame sparked to life on its own, casting shadows that writhed across the walls. There, in the pooling light, the guest materialized, not a specter, but a woman, her form translucent, dressed in a gown of sodden muslin, eyes hollow as tidal pools. She didn't move, but Elias felt the pull, a whisper in his mind. Asterisk stay. Join the tide. Asterisk his legs buckled, the poker clattering to the floor. Downstairs, Lydia's voice pierced the haze. Elias. And he clawed his way back, slamming the door as the woman's outline frayed into wisps. He stumbled down the stairs, breath ragged, the scent of salt clinging to his clothes. In the parlor, Lydia had dragged the sideboard against the door, her face pale but set. What was it? She demanded, helping him to a chair. Something from the water, he gasped, rubbing his temples where the whisper lingered. The journals were right. These aren't spirits. They're the drowned, bound here by the old smuggler's rights. Father's dealings with blockade runners during the war must have anchored them. The realization settled like lead in his gut. The Penbrooks weren't cursed by chance. Their blood had invited these guests, trading whispers for secrets across enemy lines. Thunder cracked overhead, rain lashing the windows like frantic fingers. Lydia lit another candle from the mantel, its flame steadying as she placed it between them. Then we end it. The root cellar at dawn, before the tide rises and they grow stronger. Her eyes met his, fierce despite the tremor in her hands. But as the light bloomed, Elias saw it. Faint outlines circling the room's edges, more guests emerging from the gloom, their forms multiplying like ripples in a disturbed pond. The night stretched on, the house groaning under the storm's assault, and Elias wondered if dawn would find them whole, or if the candles would reveal only empty chairs. Elias gripped the candlestick tighter, its wax dripping like slow blood onto the scarred oak table. The flame flickered in the draught seeping through the boarded windows, casting shadows that twisted across the walls of the old parlor. Outside, the Carolina night pressed heavy, humid air laced with the scent of magnolias and something sharper, decay perhaps, from the overgrown garden where the hidden guests had first appeared. He glanced at Thomas, His son's face pale but set, the boy's hands steady as he reloaded the old musket they'd found in the attic. "We wait for dawn," Elias whispered, his voice rough from hours of hushed arguments. "They can't cross the threshold in full light." That's what the journal said. Mary huddled in the corner, her apron clutched around Eliza like a shield, the child's wide eyes reflecting the single flame. The little girl hadn't spoken since the evening before, when the candles had unveiled the first shapes, translucent figures in tattered gray uniforms, eyes hollow as riverbed stones, drifting through the walls. Not ghosts, not quite. The journal called them echoes, remnants of the war that clung to the land like fever sweat. But they hungered, pulling at the edges of the living, whispering names from battles long buried. Mary's breath came shallow, her cautious nature warring with the fire she'd kindled in herself to protect them. Elias, the salt lines holding at the door. But what if they find another way? The chimney, a low scrape echoed from upstairs, like nails on wood, deliberate and unhurried. Thomas bolted upright, musket raised, his brave streak flashing in the way he moved, without hesitation. "Pa, it's them." Moving again. The family froze as the sound grew, a rhythmic drag, as if something heavy were being hauled across the floorboards overhead. Elias's mind raced back to the failed barricade they'd built that afternoon, the one that had collapsed under invisible weight, splintering the stairs and nearly taking Eliza with it. Their plan to seal the house had backfired, drawing the echoes closer, making the air thicken with their presence. The candle flame dipped low, then surged, illuminating a flicker at the edge of the room. There, in the corner by the fireplace, a shape coalesced, a soldier, young and gaunt, his Confederate cap askew, hand outstretched as if reaching for a canteen that wasn't there. But his eyes, God, his eyes, locked on Eliza, and a faint murmur escaped him. "Water, sister?" Mary's gasp shattered the silence. She shoved Eliza behind her, scattering the salt she'd so carefully laid. The line broke, granules skittering like fleeing insects, and the echoes form sharpened, stepping forward with a wet, sucking sound from boots that left no print. "Shoot it, Thomas," Elias barked, lunging for the poker by the hearth. The boy fired, the crack of gunpowder filling the room like thunder, acrid smoke curling up to mingle with the wax. The echo wavered, dissolving into wisps that reformed higher, drifting toward the ceiling. But the shot had roused more. From the shadows, two others emerged, their whispers overlapping in a chorus of pleas and curses, drawn by the noise. The house groaned as if alive, floorboards creaking under strains unseen. Eliza whimpered, clutching Mary's skirts, her small fingers tracing the hem like a talisman. Elias swung the poker, meeting empty air as an echo brushed past, cold as grave mist, raising gooseflesh on his arm. It carried the faint rot of unburied dead, a reminder of the battles fought on this very soil, where the Penbrook's ancestors had hidden their sins in the root cellar. "We can't stay bottled up," Thomas panted, reloading with fumbling hands, his wit surfacing in a grim half-smile. "Pa, the journal mentioned the river. Salt water might dissolve them. If we make a run for the back door." Mary shook her head, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "Too risky with Eliza. They'll swarm us in the open." But as another scrape echoed from the hall, closer now, the family exchanged glances, the weight of their isolation pressing like the humid night. The candle burned lower, its light revealing more shapes gathering at the edges, guests uninvited, their hidden forms no longer content to lurk. Dawn was hours away, and the echoes' hunger grew with every flicker. Elias gripped the candlestick tighter, its wax dripping like slow tears onto the scarred oak table. The flame flickered, casting shadows that twisted across the walls of the attic, where the air hung thick with dust and the faint, metallic tang of old blood. Below, the house groaned under the weight of the night, but up here, the real weight pressed on his chest, the knowledge that the lights they'd lit weren't just revealing the past, but inviting it closer. Clara knelt beside the trunk they'd pried open earlier, her hands trembling as she sifted through yellowed letters and faded photographs. "These aren't ours," she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the hush. One image slipped from her fingers, a group of figures in stiff collars, their eyes hollowed out by time, staring back as if they'd been waiting. Thomas hovered behind her, his usual quips silenced for once, while Eliza pressed against a far wall, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The candle's glow caught the edges of their faces, sharpening the fear etched there. He'd thought snuffing the flames downstairs would end it, the way the guests had materialized, translucent forms slipping from the corners like smoke given shape. But the attic held the source, or so the ravings in grandfather's journal claimed. The candles remember, Elias muttered, echoing the words that had driven them up here. He'd lit this one reluctantly, its wick black and stubborn, pulled from the hidden compartment in the floorboards. Now, as the flame steadied, a chill seeped through the cracks, and the first whisper slithered into the room. Not from the wind outside, but from the wood itself. Thomas stepped forward, his boots scuffing the planks. "We burn it all. The letters, the pictures, everything." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the bravado. He snatched a handful of papers, crumpling them toward the candle, but Clara caught his wrist.
"Wait. Look."
In the light, the ink on one letter shifted, words bleeding into new shapes. Asterisk, they see you now. Join us. Asterisk, the family froze, the attic suddenly smaller, the shadows lengthening like fingers reaching out. Eliza whimpered, her caution fracturing into panic. "It's spreading. The light. It's pulling them up." She pointed to the ladder, where faint outlines began to coalesce, pale hands grasping the rungs. Elias moved to block the way, but the candle in his hand flared brighter, illuminating faces he almost recognized, distant kin, perhaps, or the uninvited souls who'd lingered in the Penbrook bloodline for generations. The hidden guests weren't strangers, they were echoes, hungry for the warmth of the living. Clara stood, resolve hardening her features. "We use it against them. Thomas, the oil lamp. Mix it with the wax." Her plan spilled out in hurried breaths. Melt the cursed candle into something bigger, a blaze to consume the attic and sever the ties. Thomas nodded, fumbling for the lantern in his satchel, but as he poured the oil, a gust, impossible in the sealed space, knocked it from his grasp. The liquid splashed across the floor, igniting in a whoosh that lit the room like dawn. Flames raced along the beams, devouring the letters and photographs in a frenzy of orange and black. The whispers turned to shrieks, the shadows writhing as if burned. Elias shoved Eliza toward the ladder, Clara hauling Thomas behind, but the fire leaped unnaturally, coiling around the trunk like a living thing. One of the forms solidified midway down the rungs, a woman in a tattered gown, her eyes milky voids fixed on Clara. "You called us," she hissed, voice like rustling leaves. They tumbled into the hallway below, the attic door slamming shut on its own as heat blasted through the cracks. Coughing, Elias sealed it with a fallen beam, his hands blistered. The house trembled, but the shrieks faded, replaced by a hollow silence. Clara leaned against the wall, soot-streaked and shaking. "Did we stop it?" Thomas wiped his face, glancing up at the ceiling where embers glowed faintly. Eliza clutched her mother's arm, silent tears carving paths through the grime. But as the last wisps of smoke curled from the door, Elias felt it, a subtle shift in the air, cooler now, carrying the scent of rain on distant fields. The candles had revealed the guests, yes, but in banishing them, something else stirred awake deeper in the foundations. The family exchanged glances, the weight of survival mingling with dread. Dawn was hours away, and the house, their prison and protector, whispered promises of more revelations yet to come. Elias gripped the candlestick tighter, its wax dripping like blood onto the scarred floorboards of the attic. The flame flickered erratically, casting shadows that twisted into shapes no human form should take, elongated limbs, eyes like voids peering from the gloom. Below, the house groaned under the weight of the storm, rain lashing the windows as if the sky itself sought entry. He had come up here alone, leaving Amelia and the children huddled in the parlor, their whispers a fragile barrier against the night. But the candles had lied, or perhaps told truths too terrible to bear. The hidden guests were not strangers, but echoes of the family's own sins, clawing their way back. The air grew thick, laced with the metallic tang of old blood and something sweeter, like overripe fruit left to rot. Elias's breath came in shallow bursts. He scanned the rafters, where dust motes danced in the candle's glow like spectral fireflies. A soft scraping echoed from the far corner, deliberate, like nails etching a message into wood. He stepped forward, boots creaking on the planks, heart pounding a rhythm that matched the thunder outside. "Show yourself," he muttered, voice barely above the wind's howl. No answer, only the scrape again, closer now, as if whatever lurked mimicked his movements. Memories flooded him unbidden. The war, the fields of South Carolina turned to mud and bone, the promises he'd broken to survive. The candle's flame dipped low, nearly snuffing out, and in that momentary dimness, he saw it, a figure huddled against the wall, translucent at first, then solidifying into the likeness of his brother, Thomas, dead these 5 years from fever. But Thomas's eyes gleamed with unnatural hunger, his mouth stretched in a grin that revealed teeth filed to points. "Elias," it whispered, voice a rasp like wind through dry leaves. "You lit the candle. Now share the light." He backed away, the candlestick trembling in his hand. The attic seemed to shrink, walls pressing in with the scent of mildew and decay. Thomas, or what wore his face, rose slowly, joints popping like breaking twigs, its form flickering between man and something older, furred and clawed, a remnant of the gullah tales their mother had whispered to frighten them as boys. Elias's mind raced. The family's heirloom candles, passed down from Grandpa's smuggling days, were said to reveal truths in the dark. But this was no truth he wanted. He swung the candle like a weapon, wax splattering across the floor, but the figure only laughed, a sound that burrowed into his skull. Downstairs, Amelia's voice pierced the chaos, faint but urgent. "Elias!" The children's candles, their burning blue. Panic surged through him. If the attic held his brother's ghost, what horrors danced in the parlor's light? He turned toward the ladder, but the figure lunged, fingers like ice grazing his arm, pulling him back into the shadows. The candle fell, rolling across the floor, its flame guttering but refusing to die. In the spilling wax, Elias glimpsed faces, his father's stern gaze, his wife's tear-streaked cheeks, trapped, pleading. The hidden guests were multiplying, feeding on the light they themselves had kindled. He kicked out, boot connecting with the apparition's chest, sending it sprawling with a hiss. Scrambling for the candle, Elias snatched it up, the heat searing his palm. He bolted for the ladder, descending in frantic leaps, the attic's door slamming shut behind him like a coffin lid. The house felt alive now, floorboards shifting underfoot, whispers slithering from the walls. In the parlor, Amelia clutched young Lila to her breast, while Tobias stared wide-eyed at his candle, its blue flame illuminating a shape in the corner, a woman in tattered rags, her skin mottled like bog water, humming a lullaby that curdled the air. "We can't stay," Elias gasped, slamming the parlor door against a pursuing chill. The guests were here, revealed and ravenous, drawn by the Penbrook blood that stained their lineage. Outside, lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the pecan trees bent like supplicants. Amelia nodded, her face pale but resolute, gathering the children as Elias smashed the remaining candles against the hearth. Flames erupted, not warm but cold, casting the room in ethereal blue. The hidden ones shrieked, forms dissolving into smoke, but not before one clawed at Tobias's leg, leaving a mark that wept black ichor. They fled into the storm, the house receding like a beast sated for the night. But as Elias glanced back, the attic window glowed faintly, a single candle relit by unseen hands. The guests would wait, patient in the dark, for the family's return. Elias Penbrook gripped the candlestick tighter, its wax long since melted into grotesque drips that hardened like scars on the wooden table. The flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across the parlor walls, where the air hung thick with the scent of charred oak and something sweeter, almost floral, like the perfume his mother used to wear on Sundays. But Mother was gone, buried under the magnolia tree out back, and the figure emerging from the gloom bore her face, yet its eyes gleamed with a hunger that twisted the familiar into the profane. "Stay back," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like dry leaves underfoot. His sister Clara huddled behind him, her fingers digging into his arm, nails bitten raw from nights of his torment. The candle's light had started it all, weeks ago, when they'd lit it to ward off the chill of Reconstruction's endless rains. But instead of warmth, it unveiled them, the hidden guests, souls tethered to the house by chains of regret and unfinished sins. Father's old ledger, stained with debts from the war, had been the first to summon whispers. Now, they were solid, stepping from corners where dust motes swirled like lost prayers. The apparition, Mother, or what wore her skin, tilted its head, lips parting in a smile that revealed teeth too sharp for memory. "Elias, my boy," it murmured, voice echoing as if from a well. "You've kept the light burning. Don't you see? We're all that's left of home." Clara whimpered, pressing her face into his shoulder. She'd been the brave one once, the one who'd argued with Father over the slaves' freedom before the Yankees came, but now her caution had curdled into fear, every shadow a betrayal. He thrust the candle forward, the flame leaping as if alive. The figure recoiled, its form rippling like smoke over water, but it didn't vanish. No, these guests were stubborn, rooted in the house's bones, the very beams Father had hewn from the swamp oaks, built on land stolen from the Gullah folk who'd cursed it long before. Elias had found the old root doctor's pouch in the attic, buried under ledgers, its herbs brittle and accusing. "We end this," he said, more to Clara than the thing. "The fire, it's the only way." Clara nodded, her wit sharpened by desperation. The hearth. Pour it there, like grandfather's stories of cleansing. But her voice trembled. She'd seen what the flames did to Cousin Theo last week, when he tried to burn the ledger and ended up with blisters that wept black ichor, the guests laughing from the rafters. Elias moved, boots scraping the warped floorboards that groaned in protest. The parlor spun in the candle's glow, portraits of stern ancestors leering down, their eyes following like accusations. One step, two. The figure lunged, cold fingers brushing his sleeve, carrying the chill of the grave. He swung the candlestick, wax splattering like blood, and it hissed, recoiling again. Clara darted to the hearth, shoving kindling into the grate with hands that shook but didn't falter. "Hurry," she gasped, striking flint until sparks bloomed. The hidden guests stirred now, not just Mother's shade but others. Father's specter with his whip-scarred palms, the overseer whose neck bore rope burns from justice unmet, and faceless slaves whose eyes burned with silent fury. They closed in, a murmur rising like wind through the pines. "Join us. The light reveals truth." Elias reached the hearth, heart pounding against his ribs, and tilted the candle. Wax pooled, then ignited as Clara fed it dry moss from the pouch. Flames roared up, hungry and orange, devouring the air. The shades shrieked, forms twisting as the fire licked at their edges. Mother's figure dissolved first, melting into wisps that smelled of rot and regret, her plea dissolving into silence. Father followed, his ledger spirit crumbling to ash that swirled up the chimney. The others pressed, cold seeping into Elias's bones, but he held firm, feeding the blaze with pages torn from the attic, promises broken, lives bartered. Clara's hand found his, steady now, their shared blood a tether against the unraveling. As the fire peaked, the house shuddered, windows rattling like bones in a gale. The last guest, a child, perhaps their unborn sibling, eyes wide with unspoken loss, reached out, then faded, leaving only embers and the scent of smoke. The parlor fell quiet, the candle guttering out in a final wisp. Dawn crept through the cracks, gray light painting the walls bare. Elias slumped against the mantel, Clara beside him, both marked by soot and exhaustion. The house stood, but changed, emptier, the air lighter, though the magnolias outside whispered of costs yet unpaid. They rose together, stepping into the morning, the hidden guest's absence a hollow victory, their own reflections in the dew-kissed glass forever altered.